Our first speaker this morning is Toni Hardesty. She is the state director of the Nature Conservancy, but her professional career spans state and NGO leadership, with federal and private experience sprinkled in. Many of you might have interacted with her as Director Hardesty at Idaho DEQ, and in fact, it's hard for me to just call her Toni. And in fact, Toni lives her outdoor enthusiasm. Now, I asked each of the panel members today why they said yes to this particular symposium. Toni said yes because for 25 years in the science field, she has seen way too many talented female employees leave the profession or fail to advance to the upper management ranks. She's confident that we all together can take steps to help reduce the leakage of talented women in the workforce, and she wants to be part of that conversation. Please help me welcome Toni Hardesty.
So in honor of International Women's Day, which is coming up, I wanted to start with a collage of pictures of all the incredible conservationists that we work with all over the world. So as we start today, I was thinking that maybe the best place to start is with the numbers. So let's start with this number, 1 million. The number of additional job openings in science, technology, engineering, and math sector that need to be filled by 2018. 16, the percentage of bachelor degrees that we expect to specialize in the science, technology, engineering, and math sector, or what we call the STEM field. 24, the percentage of women that hold a job in the STEM field. 14, the percentage of the average gender wage gap in STEM jobs between what men and women make. 25, the number of years I have been working in this profession. 1, the number of female supervisors that I have had in 25 years. 6, the number of individuals who have played a significant role in helping me advance my career. 6, the number of those individuals that have been men. 5, the number of trusted individuals that I consulted when I was deciding whether to pursue the Director of Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ, job. 3, the number of trusted advisors, all men, who encouraged me to pursue the DEQ Director opportunity. 2, the number of trusted advisors, all women, that discouraged me from pursuing the DEQ opportunity. And 1, the number of times in 25-year profession that I have given a public speech on the issue of gender diversity in the workforce. So as I sat down to prepare this, I asked myself, why is it that in 25 years, this is the first time that I have publicly talked about this issue? It certainly is not because I don't care or I haven't been greatly concerned about this for a very long time. But what I realized as I sat down to work on this is, and as I had several conversations with people, is that this can be a difficult and uncomfortable conversation for people, both men and women, to have. As I interviewed and talked to people about this, I noticed a lot of fidgeting and squirming as I approached people about this topic. People that I talked to admitted that as a woman, this can be an uncomfortable discussion topic because you can feel like you're blaming, being whiny, or asking for special treatment. Men told me that it's hard to discuss this topic without fear that you will sound defensive, or worse, clueless. So part of today's challenge is for all of us to get comfortable talking about this issue. I also confess to a second reason that I have avoided talking publicly about this issue, and it's because I don't have all the answers. See, I tend to favor talking on topics where I actually do know the answers. And this is clearly not one of them. You will have the opportunity in the next few hours to hear from some experts that do have many of the right answers, but that is not me. I am not an expert in the field, and I don't pretend to be. But what I do have and what I would like to share with you today is 25 years of living this subject. And according to statistics that you will see today, apparently beating the odds by first choosing this field, second, choosing to stay in this field, and third, becoming a senior manager in the field. So I'm stepping out on a limb today. I'm getting comfortable discussing with what can be a sensitive subject. I'm getting comfortable that I don't have all the answers, but hoping that you will join me today in a dialogue and a quest to enlighten ourselves about this really important issue and what each and every one of us can do to make a difference. First, let's acknowledge that we have come a long way since the day in 1900s that suffragist Susan B. Anthony pledged her life insurance policy to the University of Rochester on a fundraising deadline. This desperate move clinched a deal with trustees that allowed women to enroll. Pioneers like Anthony, Marie Curie, and Rachel Carson have opened institutional doors, modeled scientific brilliance, and paved the path for those of us that have come later. And yet, as you will see, despite this progress, women are still lagging in the numbers. So let's go back to those numbers for a quick second. The US has a need for an additional 1 million people employed in the STEM field by 2018. That's good news, right? So what's the problem? The problem is that currently, as a nation, the US is not graduating enough STEM majors to supply this demand. To further compound the problem, while women are enrolling in college in record numbers, only a minority are choosing to major in the STEM field. Doubly aggravating is the fact that many women who choose a STEM major do not choose to stay in that field. When it is all said and done, women, who comprise 48% of the US workforce, only make up 24% of the STEM workforce. So the fact of the matter is that if you're sitting here today as part of a company, a university, government, or nonprofit, and if you need employees within the STEM field to survive and thrive, you need to be capitalizing on the entire population of intellectual capital that is available. And quite frankly, we are not doing that. In fact, when we are only capturing a small percentage of potential employees, it means that we are forced to reach deeper in the barrel to less qualified applicants to fill the number of positions and employment needs that we have. This, in turn, prevents us from doing our job of promoting the best scientists, and in the end, society is paying a price of limiting the advancement of science. So in addition to missing out on intellectual capital and the scientific progress that comes with it, why else does diversity matter in the workplace? It matters because there is a strong case between an organization's business goals and the diversity of their workforce and leadership. While you may not work for a for-profit company, the outcomes that I'm about to speak to are relevant and transferable to government, universities, and nonprofits as well. There have been a number of studies evaluating financial performance of companies, comparing those that have diversity in leadership positions and on boards as compared to those that don't. Studies show that for US Fortune 500 companies, that those with women on their boards of directors have an average of 46% greater return on equity. Similar results panned out when you looked at the representation of women in senior leadership. The companies with the highest representation of women in senior leadership positions had 35% higher return on equity and 34% higher total return to shareholders. Studies also show that many other positive outcomes for companies occur when they have diversity in their workforce and leadership. In fact, show me a diverse workforce and leadership group, and I'll show you the following outcomes. First, the majority group improves its performance in response to minority involvement. Said a different and more blunt way, basically, the group behaves better when you have diversity as part of the group makeup. Secondly, an inclusive leadership style reduces turnover and improves performances of diverse teams. In fact, a study of government agencies in the United States found that employees reported higher levels of satisfaction at agencies where diversity is effectively managed and employees perceive a high level of organizational fairness. Third, in study after study, gender-inclusive leadership had clear, significant, and positive effect on corporate social performance, including community relations, governance, employee relations, the environment, and human rights. And finally, diversity results in better problem solving and increased creativity and innovation. Want to solve a highly complex problem? Get a diverse team together, and they will outperform the homogeneous team time and time again. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, that we now all agree that it's critical to recruit, retain, and promote women within the STEM field, both because we know we need to capitalize on our entire intellectual capital and because study after study shows improved performance at all levels of the organization when we have diversity represented. So what then is standing in our way? For one thing, it's this. This is a quote of a professor at a prestigious university. However, before everyone jumps to conclusions and starts pointing fingers, let's look at the rest of the quote. Yes, that's right. The quote is from a woman. Professor Raymond of Stanford University discovered that she suffered from the same bias that 70% of women and men across 34 countries suffered from. This bias, revealed in a test by Harvard University, showed that we see science as more male than female. We tend to associate men with math and science and women with liberal arts and family. Couple this with a study that Yale researchers published last year showing that physicists, chemists, and biologists are likely to view young male scientists more favorably than women with the exact same qualifications, and you start seeing the problem. In the Yale study, presented with identical summaries of accomplishments of two imaginary applicants, professors at 6 major research institutions were significantly more willing to offer the man a job. If they did hire the woman, they set her salary on average $4,000 lower than the man's. Surprisingly, female scientists were as biased as their male counterparts. This is a result of biases that have been formed by images and attitudes that we have all been absorbing since birth. In addition to this unconscious bias towards women and science, other barriers stand in our way toward the equal representation in the field. One of the factors is the lack of female role models. I love this diagram that physicist Sharon Keifer-moderator used to demonstrate this problem. Female employees conclude consciously and unconsciously that these careers are not for them because they don't see people like them in the field. This effect is very, very powerful. We all have a natural affinity for wanting to fit in, and when we look around and don't see others that look like us, that we can visualize ourselves becoming or aspiring to, we tend to move away and find a different place, organization, or field where we can see ourselves fitting in, belonging, and succeeding. Put a slightly different way, a researcher in Sweden labeled this phenomenon the non-event. She said we often look for the event that discourages women from staying in the field. but her research showed that it is often what she termed the non-event that discourages women. It's the years of not being seen, heard, encouraged, included, invited, welcomed, greeted, or asked along. These non-events are powerful ways to subtly discourage, sideline, or exclude women from science. Women also have the difficult task of balancing the competency and likability trade-off. This quote from Sheryl Sandberg, I think, says it all. Numerous studies have shown that women who excel in traditionally male domains are viewed as competent but less likable than their counterparts. Behaviors that suggest self-confidence or assertiveness in men often appear arrogant or abrasive in women. Meanwhile, women in positions of authority who enact a conventionally feminine style may be liked but not respected. In fact, a study evaluating professors showed that male professors were rated high if they showed the characteristics of knowledge and leadership. But for female professors to be rated high, they needed to show not only knowledge and leadership, but also to be perceived by students as warm and sensitive. That's a tough line to walk. I'll share with you a story of one of the many times that I found myself trying to navigate this issue. When I was working in the for-profit sector as an environmental consultant in a very male-dominated field, I had a senior engineer who worked for me. I clearly recall the day that he and I were in a very intense conversation about a particular project. He had many more years of experience than I did, but I knew that he had some blind spots on this project that were really important, and I just couldn't let it drop. So after this very intense conversation, the next day he came into my office. And he said, you know, I went home last night, and I thought about our conversation, and I just wanted to let you know today that I think you have chutzpah. Well, I can tell you where I came from. Chutzpah was never used as a flattering term. So I could feel the hair sort of starting to stand up on the back of my neck. But I paused and I said, why chutzpah? And he said, hey, I actually mean it as a compliment. Don't be offended. He said, to me, chutzpah is someone who has nerve or daring, but with just the right amount of attitude. And I like that about you. Well, I'm still not sure to this day whether I should have been offended or not, but I chose not to be. And in fact, it became a bit of the go-to line between himself and me and my close-knit staff. And they used it in a good-natured way to describe me throughout my rest of the years when I worked with them. In fact, when I left the organization, this was one of my going-away presents. This book, The Chutzpah Connection. And the inscription reads, Dear Toni, may the chutzpah be with you. We'll miss you. Aloha. So in addition to conscious biases and barriers, we also can be subject to barriers of our own making. Our inherent tendency to underestimate our own ability. Going back to the numbers, I mentioned that when I was deciding whether to pursue the DEQ director position, I sought out advice from 5 people. 3 of them were men, and all 3 were absolutely adamant that I should pursue this opportunity and that the reward was much greater than the risk. The 2 women that I sought counsel from both advised me to wait. Their rationale was that I enjoyed my current job, so why abandon it? And they thought that I may not be ready for all of the conflict and politics that were sure to come with that position. Better to wait a bit. As women, we have this tendency to underestimate ourselves and maybe each other. Not that we don't think we or others are capable, but we often don't think we are ready yet. And this tendency to think that we are not ready yet results in missed opportunities, and in the long run, I would argue, less challenging careers. So as promised, You're going to hear from speakers that are experts in this field today, talking about what you and your organization can do to further this discussion and make strides in removing some of these biases and barriers. But first, drawing from 25 years in the field, I want to share what I believe each and every one of you, regardless of your organization, title, role, or position, can do. First, recognize that unconscious bias is real. It exists in both men and women. If we don't acknowledge it, then it is left unchecked, and it can commandeer both our behavior and our rational thought process. Denial that bias exists gives it more power. But if we are vigilant, we can reduce this bias in our decisions. The same way we can overcome other habits, such as biting one's fingernails or saying when speaking, we can overcome gender bias through deliberate and conscious strategies. I saw this personally in action a number of years back when we were interviewing candidates for a job opening. After reviewing all of the resumes, the committee came together to discuss and choose final candidates to interview. After listening to the discussion for a while, one of my fellow panelists addressed the committee and said, "Have you noticed that when we talk about the women candidates, we specifically talk about their experience or the lack thereof? But when we talk about the male candidates, we talk about their potential?" This stopped me dead in my tracks because she was absolutely correct. It was a clarifying and enlightening moment for all of us. Since that time, I have been keen to pick up on this tendency in interview panels and have helped to educate others on this unconscious bias. So acknowledge that unconscious bias is real, and then challenge yourself and others to overcome this practice. Second, change your action that results in non-events for women. What I'm asking you to do is to reach out and encourage, invite, welcome, include, and promote women who are working in this field. This is a picture of our LEAF intern program. LEAF stands for Leaders in Environmental Action for the Future, and it focuses on getting urban teenagers involved and engaged in the conservation field, something that likely wouldn't happen to them if they weren't being mentored by staff at the Nature Conservancy. One of the program goals for the LEAF program is to help close the gender, racial, and cultural gap that exists in our conservation field. At the beginning of this talk, I told you that 6 people had played critical roles in helping to promote my career, and that all 6 of those were men. Well, the other item to note is that only one of those men had an official role as a supervisor. The other 5 were unofficial sponsors, promoters, advisors, whatever you would like to call them. They were people who cared about my success and took it upon themselves to reach out to me, to include me, to offer support and advice, and to encourage me. Yes, my supporters happen to be all men, but both women and men leaving here today should make a commitment to do this for others. Now for you supervisors in the room. You should know you play a critical role. In addition to my 5 unofficial career mentors, maybe my strongest advocate was one of my first supervisors. He went the extra mile to coach me, encourage me, and to make sure that I knew that he saw that I had a bright career in front of me. These individuals made all the difference in the world for me. They were the people who kept me going, they were the people who convinced me to stay in this career, and they were the people that convinced me that there was an upward mobility path for me. And for my female colleagues in the room, recognize your tendency to underestimate your own and others' readiness to take on the next big challenge or promotion. I love this quote from Marissa Mayer, CEO of Yahoo. She goes on to say that doing things that you are not quite ready to do is how you grow. And when there are those moments of, wow, I am not sure I can really do this, and you push through, those moments are when you have a breakthrough. So remember, curiosity didn't kill the cat per se, but rather it led it in the right direction. Being willing to take a leap of faith and see where the lessons lead you, because most likely it will take you to the exact place you're supposed to be. Lastly, in order to succeed, one needs to be courageous and fearless when career opportunities present themselves. Or as I like to say, have chutzpah. Have chutzpah in pursuing your career goals, in inviting others along, and addressing directly the biases and barriers that are holding back the much-needed advancement of women in science. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Dr. Tom Kalous. Dr. Tom is best known for his work on the role of emotional intelligence in the workforce and in leadership. This is a man who constantly thinks about the role of leadership and what makes a leader in conflict and change. In addition to his private practice, and you have the details of that in your program, the biographies of all of these speakers in great detail, so you can really see what awesome people they are. Tom shares his expertise as faculty for the National Conservation Leadership Institute, where I had the benefit and pleasure of learning from him as a member of Cohort 4. I can attest to his inviting and humorous teaching style and the rich context of real-life experiences that he brings to us from his investigations over 15 years. Dr. Tom is here today because he believes that the more we understand the biology of being human and the implications it has for how we relate with one another, the more effective we all become in all aspects of life. He felt that this symposium felt like the perfect forum to discuss the biology that underlies our gender differences, and it will certainly speak to how we can leverage those differences in very powerful ways. Please help me in joining and say good morning to Dr. Tom.
So I would like to talk about the biology that underlines the differences in our genders, but as I go through this, I want to, if I can figure out how to make this work, here we go. Give a little word of caution, because I'm going to talk about some things that may sound like I am reinforcing stereotypes, and I don't want to give that impression at all. As I'm talking about this today, I want to talk about the average male and the average female and what we've learned about our brains. We're going to get into brain biology and what underlies how we are all different and how we're much the same. But I'm going to be talking about the average male and average female brain as we go through. And I want to make sure that you understand that I understand that there's a small difference between the average male and the average female, and there's a huge difference between people on the extremes. So there's women that will not fit at all what I'm talking about. There's men that won't fit at all what I'm talking about. But as we have dived into understanding how our brains work, and really we've just opened the door with a thing called social neuroscience, and I'll talk about that in a second, to really get at how do we operate. And then I'll get into the implications for how do we deal with some of the biases that Toni was talking about. Because if we understand how this works, we can understand where some of those biases come from, and then I can give you some suggestions about how to overcome that as we go along. So a little history of studying gender and understanding gender. For centuries upon centuries now, it has been a male-dominated world. Will we not agree with that? At least for the course of our country over the last few centuries. And in around 1960s, 1970s, there was a real bias or a movement, at least in the academic world, to embrace feminism, which brought lots of great changes along with it, but it also brought a little bit of a bias against men. And we don't often talk about that bias against men. There's a bias against women, but in my clinical experience and in my training, I was really taught that men were horrible people. They were unemotional, they were unavailable, they were lousy communicators, and everything that was wrong with society was really about white guys. And so what I'd like to take is a little different approach to say, I don't really think that pointing fingers and blaming is a great approach. And so I'm going to try to normalize those differences between men and women and to give us some language and some ways of understanding each other that I think will be positive and helpful as we move forward and bring a little more equality into the workplace. So that's a little bit of the clinical experience. And then along with that, shortly after the feminist movement, then there was a movement towards androgyny. I don't know if anybody's ever heard that term, but in psychology it was a really big thing in the 80s. You know, what we need to do is we need to get rid of all these gender differences. That was the thought. And that everybody was a blank slate. And if you just parented right, you could bring your kids up to not have any of those gender differences, right? So my daughter came along about 8 years ago and completely destroyed that theory. My ex-wife and I agree on parenting amongst a lot of other things, even though we're no longer together. We do work very well as a partner in parenting. And we thought, gosh, wouldn't it be great if we brought up a young woman who just wasn't a victim of the societal norms and wasn't going to fall into those patterns that we expect girls to fall into. So we'll help her by doing all these things that the magazines say and the research says, maybe we'll hand her trucks and cars and we'll give her, things we'll give her colors that aren't gender biased. We won't, make everything pink and all that. She came out of the chute and the only color she wanted in her world was pink. I had nothing that I could do about that, right? And she would not play with a truck, was not interested in it to save her soul. She didn't really play with dolls, but she gravitated towards things that we would traditionally consider as female, even though we had enlightened parents who were working to not fall into those biases. So something's going on, and actually this is where social neuroscience comes in and starts to say, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't try to be one gender. Maybe we shouldn't try to all be the same. Maybe there's something about this diversity thing that works, and maybe there's a biological basis behind this. So for those of you that may not have heard of social neuroscience, it's a new field in psychology, relatively new field, where we can actually measure what's going on in your brain while you interact with other people. And so we can look at the electrical chemical activity, the blood flow activity. We can measure brain size and other activities in a way that we've never been able to do before. And up until about 15 years ago, the only way that we could understand what was going on in a person's brain was to go back and look at the brain after the person died and try to figure out what was different about that brain that might describe how they behaved and their personalities. Now we can actually look at your brain while you're interacting and see those differences. So everything that I'm going to talk to you about today is based in some of the latest research on social neuroscience and actually looking at how our brains function and what parts of the brain do what. So with that, I'm going to give you a little bit of a look at the brain here, and this is the outer cortex, just to give us some of the parts that are implicated really in our personalities, what make us different, what make us the same, and also what drive our emotions, because as you'll learn here in a little bit, you might think that we're rational beings. In other words, that we make all of our decisions based on what the outer cortex, this part that we're looking at here, says, the logical part of our brain. The research is very clear that no, your behavior is driven by what's going on at a deeper level down in the emotional center of the brain, and not nearly as much out of the outer cortex as you'd like to think. But this is the outer cortex, and there's a couple of places that I want to point to. The first one's the purple part, which is the part right above your eyes. And we're looking at the left side of the brain. That's the prefrontal lobe, or the frontal lobe and the prefrontal lobe. And that's the part of the brain where our personalities reside. That's the part that says, is what I'm doing the right thing to be doing right now? It's the executive function of the brain. It's where morals reside, if we have any. And it's where we figure out social problems. It's also the part of the brain that scans the room around us and tries to figure out what other people are thinking and feeling by their facial expressions. Okay? A lot of activity going on in the brain, and we've learned a lot about that. You've probably all heard of attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. Okay? That is actually a disorder of this part of the brain. If we look at the chemical and electrical and blood flow activity in the brain of somebody who is truly ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity, we will see that there's very little activity going on in the prefrontal lobe. And the reason why things like Ritalin work, and I'm not up here saying I think you should put your kids on Ritalin if they have ADHD, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying when we add Ritalin or something like that to a person with that disorder, all of a sudden all the electrical and blood flow activity in the prefrontal lobe starts to look normal. And it gives them the ability then to focus on the things that a normal person would focus on. Okay? It also lightens up the rest of the brain, but it does bring that electrical chemical activity to the prefrontal lobe, and that's why it works. So if you look at the area where you see kind of the blue, red, and yellow all coming together, that's where language comes together for us. And it's an important part of our differences between men and women, and I'll share that in a moment. But the language center of the brain is where all of our words are stored, all of our ability to form our words, to put sentences together, to communicate with other people comes from that part of the brain. And I'll come back to that part in a little bit and why it's so important in the gender differences. So those are the parts of the outer cortex that really have to do with how we're different. The other parts of the outer cortex really are things like, our visual cortex, our ability to move, our sensory motor control, that kind of thing. And so they're not as implicated in the differences between us. Oh, and just going back to the outer cortex for a second. This left side of the brain, this is where logic and reason reside. This is where mathematical and spatial relations reside. This is where all the things that when we test traditional IQ, intelligence testing, it tests the function of the outer left cortex. It looks at language, logic, reason, problem solving, spatial relations. That's traditional intelligence. And amazingly enough, traditional intelligence has been defined by, guess which gender? Men. They're the ones that defined what intelligence is, and we've used those measures of intelligence throughout to try to predict how well people will do at things. Men, we didn't do a very good job of predicting things because traditional intelligence only predicts about 9% of the variance in success in a career. So there's something more than intelligence that's out there. So underneath that outer cortex, if we get into the inside of the brain, and you start to look at, if I had a pointer, I don't think my pointer, yeah, it will work. Look at that, all the way across the way. A little shaky, but there. The part that I'm shaking around right there, that's the emotional center of the brain. That is, there's no language available to this part of the brain. It is the part of the brain where anger, sadness, happiness, all the emotions that we feel, love, all those things reside or come from that part of the brain. The problem that we have is there's, again, no language available to that part of the brain, and that part of the brain is much faster than the outer cortex. It processes information about 40,000 times faster than the outer cortex does. It's also been shown through social neuroscience that, again, this is where all of our decisions actually get made. Almost all behavior is traced back to the part of the brain that has no language, no logic, no reason. And so our behaviors are not rational, they are rationalized. In other words, the inner cortex decides what we're going to do, and then the outer cortex might check in and go, I'll bet I can come up with a reason for that. And then we think we're very logical, and even men, we think we're logical. The reality is we know that every decision that the outer cortex makes, we now know that the outer cortex goes in and checks with the emotional center of the brain to say, is it okay if I do this? And the inner cortex goes, yes or no. And so it's the emotional center of the brain that drives all decisions and almost all behavior. Sometimes we can override it with the outer cortex, but we are not nearly as rational beings as we would like to think. Okay? So that emotional center of the brain is constantly scanning the world to see, is there anything that is a challenge to me? Is there anything that is a threat? And it's about protection. It's about two things. It's looking to not get hurt, number one, and then it's looking for pleasure, number two. It wants things that make it happy and make us happy. But it's very blunt in the way that it works. So all of us, men and women, we all have both of these, the outer cortex, the inner cortex. But we also know that women's brains are about 10% smaller than men's brains on average. So the original thought was, well, gosh, if it's 10% smaller, it must be 10% less effective. Maybe it's not as smart, which of course we know is not true. But we also found out that men's and women's brains are not quite the same. Not only are they different in size, but now we know that the neural pathways are very different between men and women. Okay? And one of the first signs that we had of this, I'm going to go back to that language center. If a male had a brain injury that damaged the language center of the brain, he may never ever get his language back. Once that was damaged, it could be damaged forever. It's very difficult to rehabilitate a man who has severe damage to the language center of the brain. With women, if they have the very same brain injury, they will often recover, most likely recover, all of their language ability within 3 to 6 months. How is that possible? It's the same side of the brain, it's the same part of the brain, something's going on. So social neuroscience has found that men tend to live in the left part of their brain, and the right brain is a very different brain than their left brain. Okay? The right brain has more of the artistic ability and the creativity part, and you'll find some men that are very right-brained. But most men are very left-brained, logic, reason, that mathematical ability, that kind of thing. For women, your right brain is set up a little differently. Your right brain is actually a mirror image of your left brain. So you have a backup language center in your right side of your brain that men don't have. Okay? So there's one of the major differences. The other difference is, let's go back this way. There we go. The other difference is that the two hemispheres of the brain, for men, they're not very well connected. If you look at a man's brains, they really fall into 3 different separate chunks of the brain. The left hemisphere, which is not very well connected to the right hemisphere, which neither hemisphere is very well connected to the emotional center of the brain. And I see some women going, oh, this is starting to explain so much. And men are going, I don't think I like where this is going. Whereas the two hemispheres, the outer hemispheres for women, are much more densely connected right through the emotional center of the brain. Okay? So what you get is very different language structures, and you get language that is more about how a person feels when you're talking to women, and when you're talking to men, it may sound devoid of emotion. It's not that emotion doesn't exist, it's that the parts of the brain aren't really necessarily talking to each other. So when I do seminars on this, I often ask women, what happens when you ask a man how he feels? What does he say? Anybody? Anybody say? What's that? I don't know. Yeah. Or my favorite is when he's fine. Right? How many women have heard that from the guys in their lives, right? They hear fine. And of course a woman goes, that cannot be possible because I have never felt fine in my life. I don't know what that means. So then we start the first argument between men and women, and that is, no, you don't feel fine. Yes, I do feel fine. No, you don't. Yes, I do. See, I told you, you don't feel fine. Okay. I've got some bad news for you, and the women in the room. When a guy says he feels fine, that's probably the truth. That's probably the closest that he can come to describing what he feels, because guys can feel nothing. Would you agree with me, men? There's times when a woman asks you what you're feeling, you're like, I don't feel anything, but if I say that, I'm going to be in trouble, right? And women can't fathom it because they're always feeling something. And it's because of the way their brains are set up. They are always feeling something. But here's that first part of, boy, our emotional worlds are different. We all have the access to the same emotions, but they're different because of the way our brains are set up. But they're also different, not just because of brains, but think about what emotions are. Emotions are feelings, and they truly, right, when you feel sadness or happiness or whatever, you feel it somewhere in your body. It's called a feeling because it is a feeling. Well, how do we get to that feeling? We get through it from the emotional center of the brain. The way it talks to your body is by dumping chemicals into your body. And would we not all agree that men and women have different chemistry sets? It's what makes us men versus women, right? Women have more estrogen and oxytocin available to them. Men have more testosterone and adrenaline. Well, guess what? Those are the very things that make us feel things. So we have very different feeling sets, we have very different brains, and yet we walk around, and one of the things we've been saying is, okay, well, men and women ought to be just the same. I'm not sure that that's going to be the message for me today. I'm not sure that we can do that. And I look at my daughter, Kelsey, and I think, I can't make her different than she is. Is that really what I should be doing? Should I really be trying to make her different? Or should I be trying to be different than who I am? Or should we figure out how to make these things work together? So I have a theory, and that's actually a friend of mine from my job, that we call it the 100-point theory. And the 100-point theory is that you, at any given moment, you have about 100 points that you can spend in your brain. If you're being really emotional, that 100 points get spent in the emotional center of the brain. If you're being very logical, that 100 points get spent, most of it up in the logic center of the brain. Men tend to spend their 100 points mostly in the left outer hemisphere. Women's 100 points tend to be more spread out throughout their brains. Okay. Now, why in the world would we be set up that way? Anybody have any thoughts about why our brains would be so different, or our hormonal structures would be so different? Primitive needs. Can you say more? She said men's responsibilities were different than women's responsibilities. So I won't make you say it out loud, but I'm going to, unless you want. What do you think those differences probably were? From an evolutionary standpoint, where do you think this comes from? Men were hunting, women were caring for the families. She's pretty darn close on that. I would say I would take it one step further for men. Up until very recently, men have been the ones that have been in combat. They've been the ones that have had to, they do hunt, but they also protect the herd, you know, the tribe, if you will, in a way that women didn't. Do you think it would be really good if a guy was out in military, on the military field, and he could have complete access to all of his feelings and all the feelings around everybody around him? That may not work very well. At the same time, think about how adaptive it is given the traditional, there's one thing women can do that men will never do, and that's have babies, right? Think about how adaptive that brain and chemistry setup is for that particular role. Okay. So again, I say these things not to reinforce stereotypes, but to say there is a biological basis behind those differences and what they mean for us. So a couple of things in general, men do tend to be more logical, which kind of goes along with what we talked about with getting into the STEM careers. It may be a more natural fit for men, but that doesn't mean that I'm arguing that women shouldn't be in that profession. What I would say is, can we find inclusiveness? Can we get people in there? Because I think women make fantastic scientists and do great work in the conservation field. So women are generally able to label their emotions better and recognize the emotions of others more effectively. And think about how important that is, and that goes back to Toni's point. If we have both of these working together, think about how much better your organization works. So we just talked about some of the hormones and the chemicals in the body. I want to get to why we cry. Because this is one thing I always get when I talk about emotional intelligence. Can you help me not cry? I really don't want to cry. Women often ask. When I'm in a business setting and I'm really passionate about something, I get angry or something happens and the tears well up and I know that I'm going to get beat up on if I cry. Because God knows we don't want to see anybody else cry, right? It makes us uncomfortable when we see other people cry. So we're often trying to hold back tears. But I'm going to normalize crying for you for just a second. When I talked about emotions being hormone-driven, sadness is driven mostly by estrogen. Okay? When we feel sadness, and guess, guys, you do have estrogen. Testosterone breaks down into estrogen. You need some of it. It's a good thing. So we have that available to us. But researchers in England have found that the reason why we cry is that the estrogen levels get high enough in our chest, in our chest cavity, that there's like a little mechanism that says, uh-oh, I have too much estrogen in my chest, I need to get it out of there. And the only way that it'll come out is through little tubes that come up to our eyes and excretes the estrogen through our tear ducts. That's why we cry. We cry to relieve those hormones, okay? To actually release them. And there's no other great way to get rid of those hormones. So it's a quick way to do it. And once you do cry, you feel differently, right? Because the hormones have been released. So just a little side trip there for you to think about. So some implications. I have no idea how I'm doing on time. I'm up 5 minutes, perfect. So some implications of all this. First of all, emotions happen without our permission. They're always going on inside of us because the inner cortex is always working, and it's always working faster than the outer cortex. So part of what we find is that as we try to work together as men and women, or just as different people, because I will tell you, I'm not your average guy. When I talk about this, my brain is set up more like a lot of women's. I cry at McDonald's commercials if they're good enough, all right? I can cry at a drop of a hat. My daughter will look at me and go, "What are you crying about now, Dad?" I'm just thinking about the day that you get married and I can't handle it, and you're 8 years old, so. But the emotions that we access and what we have available to us can feel very different because we have different chemistry sets. And what we tend to do, and this goes back to some of the biases, what we tend to do is we judge other people based on our view of the world. The way I approach the world is the way everybody else should approach the world. And if you're not as logical and reasoned as I am, then you're too emotional. Do you hear the negative judgment in that? If you're not as If you can't access your emotions and talk about them as well as I do, then you're just out of touch. You're in denial. Do you hear how we judge people? And the way that we tend to do it is by looking through our own glasses, our own view of the world. And whenever you're not like me, then you're too much of something or you're not enough of something. And I would really challenge us to bring those biases to the surface and to really think about that. Is that true? Just because I cry at McDonald's commercials, does that mean I'm too emotional? Or does it just mean I'm more sensitive to certain things than other people would be? So we have to find what's normal or what's within a normal range, but we tend to judge each other very negatively, very easily. So almost all of us are capable of feeling a normal range of emotions. Let's see what else I have up here. But as men and women, we do see the world differently. We solve problems differently. We think about things differently. We feel things differently. We may not feel anything at all. We may feel content and fine, and that may be just exactly what it is. But we've been told we're not allowed to do that. Or we may have lots of emotions. We may be sad or happy or angry, But we're not allowed to do that because we're in a business environment. We're in an organization. We have to work together. And yet we're keeping ourselves from being fully human as we go through that. So what do we do with this information? And I'll get back to something I alluded to before. Do we really want women to act more like men? Is that how they're supposed to be in order to be successful in an organization? Do we really want men to act more like women? And I say those as rhetorical questions. I don't know the answers. I'm going to go back to you. I don't have all the answers. I can tell us that we have, you know, the differences in biology, and each one of us is very different. We just talked about the average male of average female. All of you, everybody in here has a different emotional world. Everybody in here approaches the world in a slightly different way. Are we supposed to be changing to match other people, or how do we deal with this? And so I'm going to give you 3 things that I think that we can do. And the first one is to walk through life with authenticity. Have the courage, going back to courage, to be yourself, to know who you are, and to be that person. Okay? Be genuine in your approach to the world. You will be more vulnerable that way, but you will be more likable that way. And being likable does help. Empathy. Being empathetic towards other people, understanding that they're not like you. And not only is that okay, that's fantastic. That's great. You know, how many of us have told our children, if everybody was the same, life would be boring. But then we get into organizations and we forget that rule. How can we leverage that, and how can we see the world through other people's eyes? It's okay that you cry. It's okay that you get angry. It's okay that you look at things differently. How do we leverage that and use that for everybody's benefit? And then taking action, having the courage to take action. How can we leverage those differences by working together to step out of our comfort zone and to improve the way we approach the world by working together? So I think if we can do those things, that everybody wins. So, thank you.
Dr. Evelyn Merrill is a professor, our neighbor to the north. She comes from University of Alberta's Department of Biological Sciences, but she does have Idaho and Washington roots, a reason she is here with you today. Her current professional interest lies in linking small-scale processes to large-scale patterns in animal distributions and population dynamics, which actually might yield some interesting insight into our discussion today. Dr. Merrill has been actively involved in the Wildlife Society throughout her career, and she currently serves as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Wildlife Management. When I asked Dr. Merrill why she said yes, of course, part of it was to come be with her roots, her professional roots, but also she comes to share her perspective on her life and hindsight on pivotal points. She acknowledges her experiences are very personal, having that challenging conversation about her personal experiences, but she finds that there are some common themes that she's experienced in her life, and she believes sharing those key lessons learned may be of use to other women and men as they stare down their uncertainties along their different paths. Please welcome Dr. Merrill.
It is really a pleasure to come back after 35 years and be able to share with you an adventure that I've had, and one that's, of course, very near and dear. And some of the people in the room here are also very near and dear, and I've communicated with them over time on some of my experiences. But I'm going to take a little bit different tact, and I would like to take credit that I am an expert in this, but I don't think that that's true. In fact, I would argue that I don't know what takes you down the road and what makes that road narrow and straight to get you to the point that you want to be. I would say it is a bumpy road, and that's been my experience. But I would say there are some key lessons that I have learned along the way. And I'm going to tell you what those are right up front. There are 5 points. In my career across the different provinces and states that I've worked in, these 5 points include knowing your passion and your purpose, taking opportunities and seeking them out, working hard but playing smart, expand your thinking, and respect others and their ideas. Now, I'll start with my roots because, in fact, they go to what I would call the asphalt jungle. And for anyone who grows up and was born in New York City, you would think you would be doomed from the start to become a nature lover. And that certainly was a possibility for me. Now, my roots, though, as we look at studies and where your attitudes and what influences your life, it all comes back to the very beginning days. And I have to credit my dad with my passions today, and there are two of them. And I think about, well, were those passions when he took me to the outdoors and we went camping? Well, I'll confess I never went camping. I never went in the outdoors. I never went hiking with my dad. And so I can't claim that. But he did give me something I'm very proud of, and that is my middle name, and that is Evelyn Hunter Merrill. Now, my dad, although he didn't take me into the outdoors, he was a Wall Street lawyer. He wore pinstripe suits, and he was not an outdoor person, but he needed a tax break. And so he actually bought a farm in upstate New York, and I claim that I got my land ethic, and very truly, from a tax break, and I'm very proud of that. But my dad also gave me my second passion, and that was he was a closet scholar. He actually had a love of mathematics and a philosophy, and I'm probably one of the few people that grew up knowing the difference between a phenomenon and a nomenon. And every place that we moved to across the different states that we lived in, the first thing when we moved into a new house that went up was a blackboard. And in fact, as I've mentioned before when I've given a similar talk, I can remember one key experience for me was my dad sitting down, my brother, myself, I think I was around 8, my brother was around 10, my sister around 13. He sat us down in front of this blackboard and he explained to us the theory of relativity. And he actually wrote that in one paragraph and it hung on our wall all during my childhood. And his passion for learning was something that he gave me that I just can't tell you how proud I am of him. But I'm not the only one who comes from very diverse backgrounds, and it doesn't really matter what background you come from. Fran Hammerstrom, for example, had a similar background, and she did incredible work. Fran was, of course, the only woman graduate student of Aldo Leopold, and she produced books. She had an incredible lifestyle out on Buena Vista March, where she studied the prairie chickens. So my point is really that if you have your passions and if you know what those are, they give you purpose. And for me, they have always been the love of being in the outdoors and of learning. Now, why is it so important to know your passions and have your purpose stem from them? Well, I think the first reason is pretty clear. If you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And I have to say that's what my life has been about. I couldn't think of a better life that I could have in some alternate universe. I've enjoyed every moment of it. Doesn't mean I've had good days every day. But I think this is a truism. But I will say that I think it really, really, really is important when you have those bad days. Everybody's going to go through bad days and setbacks and outright failures. There's no question about it, but you learn from your failures. And even when you really plan, things can go wrong, like in this little cartoon here. And in fact, I had an early foundation of this. In my career, I became one of a dual career family, and my career really took the back seat there, not on purpose, but just because of bumps that I had along the way in getting jobs. But it was during those time periods I really did do some self-evaluation and said, why am I in this field? Why do I want to be in the academic realm? And I knew my purpose, and I knew my passions. So if you believe in your purpose, and you have your passion, and you're well aware of it, you'll believe in yourself. And I think that's one of the key lessons. Okay, the second lesson is take opportunities. And there was a book that came out in the 70s by Erica Young, and No Fear of Flying, and I think that really envisions it. Now, I'll bring this down to our level, that ecological thinking these days now embraces stochasticity. And I have to ask you, do you embrace stochasticity? I certainly do, and it's been a part of my travels in that I actually did an undergraduate degree in political science. And when I was in my senior year in college, I took an ecology course. And it was the most disorganized course I'd ever taken. And in fact, I got to the final exam and I was asked what big K was. And I had no idea. And yet the person, Dr. Green, in a small college in upstate New York, had such a passion for the outdoors and learning about the plants and the animals that it finally gave me a mentor that showed me the way that I was going to follow. Now, I started to apply to graduate schools with no biology background, and I got turned down, and I must have applied to 25, and each one turned me down. And then one day, at the University of Idaho, James Peake was ready to take on a woman, and he liked the fact that I had no background. I just happened to cross his path at the right time, but he always called me his experiment. Now, I was lucky because this was a very exciting time at U of I, and in fact, women were just getting into the field. When I left the program, there were 50% women in the undergrad. I was the first master's student. Evelyn Bull was the first PhD, and Winnie Kessler had joined the faculty. So it was a very good time. And in fact, Harry Hodgkinson in the early 80s published 2 papers on women and gender, and I noticed in reading those 2 papers in the last few months that there's a change, and that change is the inclusion of U of I women in his statistics, and it changed his p-value, and I'm also very proud of that. So most recently, I've been very honored to and have accepted the editorship of the Journal of Wildlife Management. And so I felt this came on also as something that I wasn't quite sure I was ready to take, but I launched into. And so you don't just fall into opportunities, you also make your own opportunities. And I think you need to keep aware of that. You really, if you know what you want and you do this soul searching, you will see the areas that you want to move into, and you have to work there. And there are ways to move forward. Just the business world has this very well studied. I don't think we do in natural resources, but just one small example: when you go to a meeting, if you're not clear, make yourself speak up in the first 5 minutes. It's just empowering in terms of being part of the group. And negotiating, business people are really good at this, but I don't see negotiation as arrogance. Oftentimes we think we're good enough, so therefore we're entitled to this. That's not the way I see negotiation, having gone through my career. It's what's going to make this job work for me for the long term so that I can put everything in my essence into this job and produce what you want. These are the things I need. So the third point then is expanding your thinking, and we heard a lot about John Pierce last night, and I think he's one that thinks out of the box as well, and I'd like to compliment him on that. And I think oftentimes we get discouraged or maybe frustrated, and we're ready to jump ship, and we just need to think about how we're thinking about things. So how you do look at the world is obviously a choice. And I've learned that over my career, that the way I look at things is a choice. And in fact, I think sometimes, and it may be because our brain chemistry, that we work in different ways, at least women do. And I often find myself, I'll put right out there, at least initially, that we have this dichotomy that we get to choose among. And this has been called something called practicing positive framing. And in fact, you can take the same incident and you can view it in different realms. So for example, you could take a criticism that is a personal assault if something doesn't go right. Okay, that's very hurtful. Or you can think of it as a helpful challenge. And I want to make sure you remember that when you get your next rejection from the Journal of Wildlife Management. Oftentimes we internalize things, and I know I've done this, that it's all my fault. But really what has helped me is to think of, okay, what's situational You know, what in this situation went wrong that was situational, and what are the causes? Because once I can identify them, then I can be a problem solver instead of internalizing it. And in fact, oftentimes it's not the end of the world, it's not a permanent thing. Oftentimes if it's in your job, you keep it in your job and not bring it home and have it affect your whole life. In fact, it is temporary and you can make it up. And it may be just the job. It's not your own whole identity involved. So I think you take a very different approach. And I know I've gone through these phases in my life where I felt more helpless, and I've turned around that to taking action. I also, and this is one I'm still working on, is taking credit. And I think we've heard that this morning. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, I was just lucky when somebody compliments you, or yeah, but it was everyone else. But really, take credit because you deserve it. And I would say something now that I worked hard. And in fact, I might say I worked damn hard, and it paid off. So take credit. And find creative solutions. In fact, I think women are very much the masters at this because they do balance oftentimes families and work as well. And in that balance, I don't think oftentimes we realize how creative we have become. And so we can be the masters at this, and we can apply that to our jobs. But working hard is the name of the game. You have to work hard. There's no question about that. And it's a good thing because it really advocates for you. If I've had mentors, and I've had several men mentors and women mentors in my lifetime, they really have been partly impressed by how hard I work out there. And sometimes my husband doesn't like it, but that's true. And it really gains you respect. It gives you confidence. That's part of the reasons I do it. People take your efforts seriously, and it establishes your reliability and your credibility, and those are important qualities. But you also need to balance your life. And I think there's often, it's been argued that women with families are can more clearly prioritize their lives and really be effective that way, because you do have to balance your life. You do have many interests, and doing that is very healthy. And for me, every time that I'm not sure that I've done the best job that I could, I look back and say, well, how have I done on average? Because it really is the average life that you want to look at, not what any single event that has occurred. At the same time, you have to play smart. And for students, I would argue, and I'm quick to do this, that really stay focused on that research question. We talked about this in the plenary the other day. That research question is very important. And I hate to admit it, but the statisticians have it right here. This is Tukey, and he said the approximate answer to the right problem, and figuring out the right problem is the key, is worth more than the exact answer to the approximate problem. So there is a lot out there on women in academia, and that's what I'm most familiar with. And it does talk about the biases that we've heard about this morning, and they do exist. There's no question in my mind. Whether they exist for good reason is unclear to me. I know in terms of academics, there are lots of studies out there comparing citation rates and publication rates, and they'll say women have fewer, and then they'll come along and will control for the resources that each individual has, and will say, no, there are no differences. So I'm quite confused, actually, on what some of the end results on all of this are. But I think there are some universal truths, no matter what these studies say, and that is that we have progressed to where the PhDs, according to an NSF study, the number of PhDs coming out of science and engineering have gained and are almost equal now. But it is keeping the women in the workplace that is the hard part. And part of that, I've got to imagine, is the family, because the peak years of family are also the peak years of productivity. And many women, for example, take time off for their family, and therefore they have restarts. And I think there's an issue there with those restarts. You can come back into a job, and in academia, for example, you can put your efforts into research, or you can actually then move into teaching instead of research. You can go into administration, and those are all wonderful things. I think if you stay in the research realm, which is what I'm most familiar with, there are some implications. And that is that success is really not a linear function of time. It is really a nonlinear function of time. And in fact, if you, there's a recent study here that's tried to model this in terms of something that you can identify with population growth. And if we have on the x-axis here, time in your career, and then research output, that you're considered a good researcher if you can be above a certain threshold, and therefore you get your grants, you get more money, and you move forward. And if you don't allocate a lot of time to research, you just don't get those grants, and you are set behind. And in fact, they argue that there is this ALE effect, similar to what we study in biological populations, that once you take time off to get restarted, it is difficult. And this is because of this nonlinear process that success begets more success. Now, what does this mean then in terms of playing smart? I would say there are some challenges for integrating women, and what can the university or managers do? If I broaden my topic here, there are maternal and paternal leaves that are very important. In fact, I just had my first male student get paternal leave here in Canada, and they get 6 months off if their family has a child, and I have to keep paying them. So it's very progressive that way. Permit things like half-time positions, but also those half-time positions must hold the capacity to go to full-time when people do. And in research, I think there's several things that are key, that when you're coming back from a restart, say from a family, or even at the beginning, you can help women by doing things like seed funding, which is hard to get because of this nonlinearity. And you can underwrite postdocs that help them get their research going faster and give them teaching relief. So at least in my realm in academia, I think there's some concrete things we can do. In terms of what you can do, I think we've heard a message this morning is be brave. And the metrics that you hear about women not publishing as much and not being cited as much, that really does not reflect your value. You can have as many metrics out there, but your value is your passion and your purpose and what you're putting in. And in the wildlife field, that's a pretty rewarding value. You can find collaborations. I found several that were just marvelous collaborations in my career, and they served me well to today. I still collaborate with those folks in these later years. Mentors, we've heard this morning, they're essential. And find effective mentors and develop a relationships that's a positive, well-defined, and productive one. Mentors are important, and oftentimes you need to seek them out. They don't always come up to you directly. And then allocate your time wisely. And for us, it's that division between teaching and research that usually is the crunch. So playing smart, well, a lot of people say, you can do it overnight, but really you have to be patient. If I've learned anything in my career, that's what I've learned, is that patience, that some people may think you are a success now, but it's been a long journey up that flight of stairs. My last point is respect others, and I have to read this cartoon because I'm starting to identify with it. The cartoon says, "My dad just wants to be treated with a little respect and dignity in his old age." And the woman goes, "Don't worry, we're used to dealing with troublemakers in this home." So start with small things. It really is the politeness, and some of my friends and colleagues have really taught me this. The people I respect, they show respect, and they do it in small ways. And in Canada, except for the fact that if you go to Parliament, they are just backstabbers and everything. But Canadians are pretty polite, or at least that's our image, but boy, I don't think we are in politics. I think this is a great phrase, and I know that it's happened because there have been some rough patches along the way, but Joubert was a French moralist, and he had this quote that said, "Never cut what you can untie." And I feel that that's a very wise proverb. Hear others and acknowledge them. I think we all want that. That doesn't mean we agree with people, but to acknowledge that they have valid opinions, I think, gets you a long way. And I think that's not just in our jobs, that's in our families, that's with our friends. That's very important. But with every rule like that, there are a few exceptions. And luckily, Tom has helped me understand, the disconnection in my husband. So now he's never won an argument in 25 years. But really, when it comes to that, you can be very productive, you can publish and publish, but you'll still perish. So what is it that you really want to be known for? And if you think about writing your own obituary, I think that makes you stop and think, what are your values? What do you really want to go out of this world leaving behind? And I think that's a useful exercise. So these are the key points that I've made. You can take them in your own lives and redevelopment. But I do think your passion that gives you your purpose, the opportunities that you have to strive to take, you have to work hard but play smart, you have to expand your thinking. There are always new creative ways to solve a problem, and respect of others. And looking back on my career, those have been ones that actually I would say have given me a lot of power in the later years of my life. Now I will end with the typical academic, and Socratic will ask you the question here and leave you with this. And if you know the answer where you've seen this slide before, please don't say it. But here is it all in a nutshell. A famous woman in wildlife, she's a wildlife biologist that you all know, and she summarized this, I thought, very nicely. If you really want something, and you really work hard, and take advantage of opportunities, and never give up, you'll find a way. Thank you.
Part of my day job is legislative liaison for Idaho Department of Fish and Game. And clearly, the next time I head to our capital, I'm going to be thinking about positive framing. Very important. Our next speaker is Dr. Gretal, and rather than butcher her name, I did not get an opportunity to meet her before this session, so I'm going to ask her to tell me how to pronounce her last name.
I'm Dr. Gretal Leibnitz.
And she is an experimental psychologist specializing in gender and organizational transformation. She's a powerhouse of institutional transformation with her work at WSU, particularly focused on academic barriers to the recruitment, retention, and advancement of faculty women in those STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, often male-dominated disciplines. She's also a CEO of a consulting firm whose mission it is to help organizations achieve optimal inclusion, efficiency, and effectiveness. Her expertise and experiences traverse topics such as workforce inclusivity, barriers to gender equity, work-life integration, and conscious bias in decision-making and organizational best practices and policies, clearly continuing many of the discussion topics we've been discussing this morning. When she said yes, she offered me a very rich and complex reason. She spent a lifetime searching for constructive solutions integrating square peg work-life demands into a round slot professional context, something that so many of us relate to, particularly for institutions that originated supporting an outdated family model of male wage earner, female caregiver. She said yes to Symposium because it's important for agency leaders of today and tomorrow to recognize there are better structures than currently exist, those which do support optimal, inclusive engagement by diverse communities of men and women. She's clearly engaged and passionate about the need to craft professional contexts that reflect and support the values of today's families, and she is here today to both advance and be part of that transformation. Please welcome Dr. Gretal.
And how many of you are partnered with a professional partner? By that I mean someone who has potentially an upper a degree, upper division degree, is engaged in work outside the home, not necessarily intending to marginalize people inside the home, but simply saying that they tend to be a little more flexible. Home is where you take it, right? Whereas a person with a specialized professional degree, it can create challenges if you're trying to integrate two careers in your journey as opposed to one career. So can you please just raise your hand if you have a partner? Great. So we're looking around the room, and I'm seeing that that's predominantly the majority of the room. We'll come back to that in just a second. I think the other thing that we're aware of is that our world is changing, and our world will always change. That's the nature of being alive, right? And we know that surviving is contingent upon being flexible and having diverse options available to us. And we can take a look at that as a scientist from simply evolutionary point of view and adaptability. We can look at it from a banker point of view. You want to diversify your holdings to be successful. We can look at it from a business point of view and innovations. I know that as an academic, we've traditionally been very siloed, and that where innovations come is in breaking down those silos. And I think also in terms of families, the more supports we have, the more successful our families will be. So one of the things, certainly as a culture, that we've done is we've tried to be responsive and adaptive to the pressures we've experienced. In the 1960s, there was tremendous discrimination in hiring practices, and before. So you could be discriminated against and not hired as a woman, as a person of color. I mean, I think, and since then, we're only talking 40 short years, we've engineered a culture that has begun to validate and create structures for inclusive practices. We've also had economic pressures that have said we can't, our systems, we need two breadwinners. And we need, it's almost like cross-training, right? We need everybody to be able to engage in providing financial support for the family, but we also need everybody to be able to change that diaper, calm that screaming baby, care for that elder, address other issues. So we're engaged in the cross-training process right now, and we're also engaged in trying to craft professional cultures that support that cross-training. We now have young men coming in that are aware that their fathers were maybe not as available to them, and young women. And so they're crafting partnerships for their families that say, we're both going to engage in our parenting. And conversely, we're both going to engage in professional activities. What happens, however, is that you then come abutted to professional organizations, agencies, institutions, and I'm coming from an institution of higher education, where there's not a lot of support for equitable engagement. There aren't policies, there aren't the procedures, there aren't the models, there aren't the leaders that are aware of the issues, the challenges, the processes it takes to support people in equitably engaging in their values. So then they're put in a position where they're forced to choose. Well, I'm going to have my baby. I'm going to have our baby. So, and I need to stay home. Well, then that innately puts the male in my family in a position where he's going to be bread earner, at least for a period of time. And then in a system that doesn't validate my opportunity to come into it from having been gone, then it creates extra barriers. It becomes harder for me to re-engage with my professional action. And conversely, my partner is already leveraged into his professional situation. So you can see why the roads evolve as they do. But unfortunately, then what happens is that you get people, because of the structures in which they've engaged, not able to embody the true values that they have. So, and that creates resentment, stresses, challenges. So what we're trying to do, and it also narrows the amount of brain power that's very available to address our challenges professionally. So how can we then invite all comers to engage in the conversation? And that's the piece that we're working on now. And that's where everybody is part of the change process. I think sometimes when you make these conversations, they tend to get gendered. You know, it's the white male that has crafted this system that has allowed the white female no voice, or underrepresented minorities, whoever they are, no voice. And I think that's not the issue. We're all responding to the stresses of our culture, our environment, lots of different ways, and we're all crafting solutions. Now we're in a place where we need to craft new solutions, and how do we do that together? So one of the things I want to talk about is the fact that the National Science Foundation has, since 2001, really tried to wrestle with this issue, particularly as related to the STEM discipline. Because as our first speaker, Toni Hardesty, mentioned, we need every brain that's available to address this issue alive and functioning and part of the solution. So in doing that, they've put over $135 million into trying to explore, identify barriers, and possible solutions to those issues for institutions of higher education. So women, how do we recruit, retain, and advance women in STEM disciplines? I think those solutions and those barriers can cross disciplines. So one of the things that they've identified in the course of almost 10 years of doing this work is that there are significant barriers, of which we alluded to many of them earlier, that are absolutely unrelated to women's ability or underrepresented minorities' abilities, interests, education, or skills. And those barriers include simply institutional or agency policies and practices. And that's where we can collectively rethink or think about what policies and practices do we have or don't have that we should have. Because those policies and practices are things that we can, are the skeletal framework of our agency. What do our policies and practices say about our value system as an agency? Does it say that we're inviting diverse inclusiveness? Does it create the framework to support that diverse engagement? The other thing that we don't have is we need to recognize the differential effects of work-family demands. And in so doing, it's not with intent to marginalize one or the other, it's simply to legitimize that this, as whole people, as an agency supporting the engagement of whole people, we honor that we are fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, and engaged in our communities. We're not just professionals in this agency. And in fact, the more we engage a whole person orientation, the more vibrant our agencies can become. So then the other is obviously lack of role models, which Toni alluded to, and female leaders. But I think that it doesn't have to necessarily be female leaders at all. I think the fact of men are just as much a part of this equation as women, and I don't want to marginalize men in this conversation at all. We need leaders, men and women, who are aware of the biases and the barriers that are created really around roles that we have. It's not really about gender unless you're talking pregnancy and delivery and lactation. It's really about the roles that we're serving as people in our community. And clearly, all of our roles are important. We don't want to not have mothers caring for our babies. We don't want fathers not engaged with their children. But we also need to have these leaders be able to articulate and advocate for and craft supports for in our agencies in support of the values that we, the people within the agency, hold. So, and that is irrelevant to gender. There are 4 key areas that, as individuals within agencies and institutions, that we need to engage, and those are, first, work-life integration systems. We've got to figure out how to do this thing with dual career earners. We used to live in a world in which our families could survive with a primary breadwinner and a primary stay-at-home partner. That just doesn't exist anymore. Only 13% of our families are ascribed to that model. So the majority of us are engaged in this very complex, how do we do all things all together? So work-life integration is critical. And the second piece is obviously mentoring, and that's across the board, men and women, in terms of how do we solve this solution, how do we solve this problem. And part of both of those areas is engagement of leadership and policies and procedures. And I go back to policies and procedures. I personally, they're boring to create, they're challenging, it creates conflict, and yet, like I said, they're incredibly important. If you don't have a mission statement, if you don't have a strategic plan, if you don't have policies that say this is what our institutions value, then how can we consistently and comprehensively support people in it? Otherwise, it's simply a matter of this good supervisor happens to be able to be supportive and passionate about equity, and so these individuals under that one individual get a lot of the benefit, whereas then you've got other people that don't have that benefit. So having policies and marketing those policies are important. Okay, so in terms of dual work-life integration, I think that's one of the things that Advance has struggled with for the last decade, and we've come up with some very good solutions. And certainly you don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to policies and procedures, and that's where I can be a good resource if you begin to craft your own policies and procedures. But in terms of work-life integration, what's the area that is the most challenging for families? Dependent care. And now, as we're moving, and initially, when Advance was young, it was simply about babies. How are we supporting young families with babies? But babies grow up to be middle schoolers and high schoolers. It just changes. And so our demand, our family need, in my mind, and I think others would concur, don't lessen, they simply become different. We need different strategies to support families. And the other piece is even if we have chosen not to have families, we're not partnered, which, quick side note, what they were finding for women to be successful in academia without the supports that we're talking about, they were choosing not to be partnered and not to have children, or not to have as many children as they would like compared to their male counterparts. Women weren't willing to make that sacrifice, so they leave the institution, they leave the agency. So with that in mind, dependent care supports are critical for all of us. And the fact is that just like child care was an issue in the 1960s, maybe a little bit earlier than that, elder care is the way of the future. And we will see our institutions and our agencies change in support of the demands of the workers for elder care issues. So that's certainly an emerging thing to be aware of. And I can help you wrestle with those issues as you begin to craft. What is available to you? One example of a model that is not very costly, because obviously expense is the critical issue here, is WSU has worked with, it used to be called Sitter City, it's now called Select Plus, because one of the most challenging areas for working parents or workers with elders support was respite care needs. What that means is if the child is sick or the elder is sick, or their traditional care breaks down, what do you do in that emergent situation? So this Sitter City, or now it's called Select Plus, is a very positive and beneficial model for helping address those issues as well as broader issues. It's a very flexible model and very inexpensive for the support that's provided. So that's an example of the type of models that are out there for dependent care support. The other issue in terms of work-life integration that is critical is simply dual career support. Like we saw here, most of us have partners that are professionals. And so how do we help families support both workers. And in the institution, what we're finding is that, for example, in STEM fields, and particularly in natural sciences areas, women are 83% more likely to have STEM partners in the same discipline as they are themselves. And that's not surprising. You go to graduate school, right? That's the narrow focus that you're in. You're looking for a partner as a young person who are either not to capture or find or be attracted to, but another individual. What's interesting about this, an individual in the same discipline, but what's interesting about this for men is only 57% of men are likely to be partnered with another professional in natural sciences. So there's a very clear pattern that then sets up a dynamic that tends to be gendered again. So you've got a person in the natural sciences who's female, and also a person in the natural sciences who's male. How are you going to accommodate both careers? So institutions of higher education are now trying to figure out when they go to hire a faculty member, can they create what they're now calling cluster hires, opportunities for multiple hires, with the intent that when a female comes in, they have an opportunity to potentially take advantage of having her male partner join that community. Now, whether it's within the same department or not, that's clearly lots of challenges around that issue. But being aware that those are the dynamics that are happening helps us be in a position to be responsive. In terms of other issues, in terms of the dual career, just be aware that the University of Texas Pan American recently had a whole symposium around dual careers, and we've crafted, that's a fabulous resource in terms of policies and procedures around that. I think the critical piece in both of work life and mentoring, which we'll get to in just a second, is again around leadership and recognizing that the middle managers, the leaders of the institution, you play an incredible role. And so as an institution, the more we can help people who are supervising others to be cognizant of these nuances and have at their fingertips resources and supports for addressing these issues, rather than simply relying on the individual's savvy and engagement in these things, but collectively create a baseline that's a common baseline. We're in a good position. So that's another thing to advocate for, not only policy and procedures, but clearly training for your leaders in this process. I think the other piece is also succession planning. We tend to, when we're thinking about leadership opportunities, it tends to be easier for us to simply go to someone that we know and we're familiar with, which tends to be either other women or other men. And in an institution dominated by men, you're going to see succession planning engaging in recreating males as the leaders. And I'm going to engage men in the question or the challenge to be courageous too. I invite you to identify underrepresented minority individuals, to mentor and actively train to be your successor. And that creates challenges in the sense that I think it is difficult for us to navigate this potential appearance of sexual dynamics. You take an older man and a younger female coming in. There's lots of reasons, and it makes sense at some level that he doesn't invite her out for a beer. He doesn't. They don't go golfing or something else. They don't go into the field and work together. And I challenge us to rethink that barrier, because it sets up a dynamic. Now, granted, I also know that young women they've got their red lights up too, in terms of, oh no, this older male is asking me to do something, and I need to be savvy about what that might mean, and is he hitting on me? But I think if we can craft and articulate what our expectations are of each other and manage that very complicated dynamic, I think we'll be able to, again, engineer a living, thriving successful community. And I'd be happy to work with people that are trying to navigate that dual-sex mentoring process. Because inevitably, when you've got a system that's predominantly male, in order for women to be successful in it, they've got to have, did I say, oh, in order for females to be successful in it, they've got to have male mentors. So the men have to be courageous enough to go there, and the women have to trust that process. So in terms of mentoring, the other piece that I wanted to move into is that outside of childcare, the mentoring was childcare in particular, but dependent care as it is emerging for elder care responsibilities. The next most challenging issue is simply that of mentoring and how do we do it. And I think we've got an antiquated model of mentoring, but I would also say it's also an incredibly confused model of mentoring. What are we talking about when we're talking about mentoring? Each of us holds an idea of what mentoring is. And some of us think it's sort of the grandfather, the singular grandfather that's going to be beneficent and share his wisdom and open doors for us. And I think it certainly can include that. But I think mentoring is really about, if we break it down, it's about individuals that help us solve challenges that we're experiencing in our life at this moment. And those challenges evolve as we evolve. As a young professional, I'm simply trying to figure out how to publish, or who should be the next person I should seek a professional engagement with, or open doors for opportunity. As a person trying to navigate young babies and professions, should I go part-time? Should I drop out for a bit? Should I balance this with my husband, and so we both work part-time? How do we do this? That's another issue that emerges. So what I'm challenging you to think about is, where are you professional right now? What are the questions you have? Where are you emerging or intending to go? What is your goal? And then seek a person that can help you answer that question. So don't go to someone and generically ask, will you be my mentor? Actively identify, do your own homework, and figure out what it is that you need right now to be successful in what you're doing. And you may identify multiple mentors. In fact, I suspect you absolutely will have multiple mentors. The other thing that is coming out of the advanced network is the reality that women, particularly underrepresented minorities, tend to be marginalized. And there's a whole host of unintentional reasons why that may happen. And I think that's the most important thing, is even though our systems are gendered, there's typically at this point, much of it is implicit, it's unconscious, and men and women share it. But the other piece that we're working with is, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Okay, social network research. So we've got women and underrepresented minorities that are marginalized. How do we connect them to the productive individuals in our agencies? We find that if we can make that strategic connection to the most productive individuals, for these marginalized individuals, their careers take off. And so what we've tried to do at Washington State University was craft an external mentors program in which the women themselves identified who are the leaders in their institution, and with a small stipend, go to them and say, I would value your assistance in XYZ, helping craft a grant, helping provide a presentation, something very strategic, and provide them with funds to travel, to communicate with each other. In this instance, our STEM women would go to the labs of the individuals that were at the other institutions and showcase the work that they were doing, as well as learn about what was happening in that lab, and conversely invite that leader in that field to come to her institution. And they would work together for a year, and it was a package deal, and they would receive, the mentor would receive some minor stipend. But that was incredibly cost effective. We had thousands of dollars that would come in as a function of those mentoring relationships that evolved. Publications, So the women's careers were leveraged strategically by partnering actively with individuals that were successful in their profession. So that's another simple way of strategically optimizing your mentoring process. That said, also just simply noting again the fact that people leave mentors for a variety of different reasons, not just professional. So with that in mind, I know that we're going to be engaging in further conversation around this issue. We've got a fabulous platform that's been set. I think we're all on a common page as to what the issues are. And I think we've got some strategies, but now the question is, how do I engage in the action to facilitate the manifestation of these strategies in your agency, in your discipline, in your life? So I invite conversation and look forward to it. Thank you very much.